Good morning. Thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful turnout. As you know, our meetings are being videotaped so that to ensure your continuing fame and glory and also public access. So given that, let's make sure everybody knows who we are. I'm Alaire Townsend, the chair. Laura?
I'm Laura Anglin. I think sitting in the former budget director position
Of New York State.
of New York State.
Ernest Logan, President of Council of School Supervisors and Administrators.
Ana Oliveira, I'm an appointee of Scott Stringer and public advocate. Letitia.
Let's all speak up
Sorry about
to
that.
make sure that
And public
everybody
advocate
can hear
Letitia.
that. Okay. Across the mic.
Michael Troskis from the Public Advocate's Office.
Jack Krauskopf. I'm at Baruch College School of Public Affairs, and I guess I'm filling the seat of a former dean of public policies.
I'm Paul Wachtel from the Stern School of Business at New York University, fulfilling the position of a former department chair at a university.
And I'm Don Boyd with the Rockefeller Institute of Government, and I'm filling the position of a budget expert.
Hi, Tom Weiner, an analyst at IBO.
Frank Basilico, Deputy Director at IBO.
Katie Mosier, also an analyst at IBO.
George Sweeting, another Deputy Director at IBO.
Elizabeth Brown, a supervising analyst at IBO.
Joseph Garba, Deputy Manhattan Borough President.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you all for coming. Let's turn to the first item of business, which is approving the minutes of the September 15th meeting. May I have a motion? Nancy?
Yeah.
Jack is seconding. Are there any comments or corrections? All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much. Ronnie, you have a director's report.
Will do. Okay, first thing I want to do is just introduce two people you've just met, Tom Weiner and Katie Mosher, who are sitting behind me. They're the two latest additions to the education team. And I also wanted to say that Beth, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, has been promoted to become head of the infrastructure team now that Anna Champney has moved on. We're currently seeking to fill a few vacancies, so if anybody knows anyone, please let me know. The first vacancy is environmental and sanitation, which is usually one person. We need someone to do children's services, and we're also in the market for someone to do health. So if you've got any ideas, we'd greatly appreciate them. Instead of just doing a laundry list of stuff we're working on or stuff we've recently completed, I just wanted to take a minute to say that those of you who closely watch the website and what we're putting out may have noticed the mix of what we've been putting out has changed somewhat in recent months. We're finding with lots of new council members and borough presidents that more and more of our staff's time has been on requests from elected officials, particularly council members and the borough presidents. And so there's a lot of work that we've recently put out in the form of memos. That's, I think, one of our... Okay, sorry. We've got David Gauci, who's in Switzerland, who wanted to join us from there.
David?
I just arrived.
Welcome. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of work at the request of elected officials. Some of them come out as memos, some of them as letters, some of them as regular fiscal briefs and New York by the Numbers publications. But some recent ones have included looking at the costs of constructing marine transfer stations to transport waste as compared with the cost of continuing to truck the waste out of the city. Another recent request was what would it cost for the city to provide free tuition to community colleges? You can understand where that one came from. Another one, cost of providing legal services to people who are in housing court who couldn't otherwise afford it, or seniors who find themselves in housing court in order to prevent evictions. Along the same lines, we're being asked to do a lot more testimony, particularly testimony before the City Council. And just the other day, we agreed to help staff a task force on tax expenditures, particularly economic development tax expenditures that's being created by the council. I think it's the first time we've ever received a request like that, and it's most welcome. The other thing I wanted to do was to thank the two people who were about to come off of the advisory board. Their terms were up, but they were gracious enough to continue to stay on until after my reappointment. Paul serves in the position of current or former chair of a graduate school of business in the city of New York. And I remember when I first saw that particular slot thinking, we're never going to fill this one. It is really hard to find someone in that position who cares about the city and cares about fiscal policy and who's willing to really step outside their normal research and teaching to do something different. And I really appreciate what you've done. You've come to the meetings, you ask good but often hard questions, and you've been available for counseling and help outside the meetings as well, and we all really appreciate it, and we'll miss you.
Thank you. I often think that the educational process was from you guys to me more than vice versa, and so I appreciated that opportunity as well. I'm going to miss it.
Well, we're going to still bombard you with emails, so it's fine. And Alaire, who's been chair, when I first got to IBO, when we were starting this place up and trying to figure out what to do, we did a number of meetings with big names in public finance in New York. And I went with IBO's first director and someone else to meet Alaire Townsend. And I was so excited. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you. And utterly intimidated. And we get to Alaire's office, and you were very helpful, but I've got to admit, you weren't hugely enthusiastic about the idea of another fiscal monitor. But over the years, getting to know you better and getting to work with you has been great. To say that it took not just knowledge of public finance and budgets, but also a lot of political acumen to pull off my reappointment and get 4 very senior city officials to agree that they really wanted to do this and not even look like you had broken a sweat was terrific. So I personally owe you a great deal of thanks, and institutionally, it's been great, and hopefully we'll do more.
Thank you.
Okay, and that was the director's report.
Okay. Well, I want to say to my colleagues on the board, it's been wonderful working with each of you. I thank you for your service. And as to Ronnie and the staff, I can't praise you all enough. You manage with remarkably few resources to turn out a remarkably large and important output. I think everybody agrees that they are helpful, they're user-friendly, and they add greatly to the quality of the debate about public policy in New York City. So there are some other monitors I wouldn't mind getting rid of, but it would be efficiency. It would be really penny wise, pound foolish to think of interfering with the work of this great organization. So congratulations, you've done a wonderful job. And so wonderful, by the way, that the 4 people I had to deal with last year in terms of pushing your reappointment through were all unanimous. There wasn't a peep of complaint, which really speaks well for all of you. So thank you. So now we come to the business of choosing the next chair of the advisory board. As you know, we have a vice chair, Nancy Waxstein, and Nancy is not feeling well today, but thank you for coming despite that. And Nancy has indicated that she is willing to assume this position. I, for one, have always found her input to be very, very important. She asks good questions, she makes constructive comments, and so I am delighted to propose that we elect Nancy as the next chair.
I when Larry asked me to do this, I said I'm neither an economist nor a a fiscal expert, but I do have a keen and passionate interest in how our city functions, mostly on behalf of the have-nots. You know, my career has been focused on human services and helping those who have the least in our city, and so that's where I come from, but I do see that the IBO has been critical in moving some of those debates along. I mean, you know, people think of the IBO as very dry and et cetera, but even looking at, well, some people think of the IBO as dry, but, you know, even looking at the topic of one of the reports today, critical, just critical for the debate about what kind of city we're going to be. So I'm really pleased to be part of this, and so thank you.
Any other comments or questions? The fix is in. We didn't ask you to leave the room. I think all your colleagues are thrilled with this news. All right, so all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Wonderful. Congratulations, Nancy.
What happens when you show up?
Right. So that bit of business having been dealt with, we turn now to staff presentations. Ronnie, do you want to introduce the subjects?
Okay, our first presentation is going to be by Beth, who you met a moment ago, who's going to be talking about an issue very close to Nancy's heart, the rising number of homeless, an issue that I guess you've worked in for decades.
Not, happily not at this moment.
Okay.
It's very, very hard to figure out what to do, actually. I just had this conversation with somebody yesterday. I said, so if you were the commissioner or you were the deputy mayor, what would you do? To all those critics. Yeah.
Okay, as Ronnie mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a report we recently put out. The long title's up here, The Rising Number of Homeless Families in New York City Between 2002 and 2012. A look at why families were granted shelter, the housing they lived in, and where they came from. So just to give some background to start, and I imagine a lot of you know about this, it's well publicized, the number of families with children living in the city shelter system has grew dramatically over the Bloomberg administration, and it actually continues to grow today. The number of families with children in shelters increased by 49% from fiscal year 2002, the beginning of the Bloomberg administration, through the end of fiscal year 2014. So a part of this increase had to do with the fact that less families were leaving shelter than entering. That makes sense. The Bloomberg administration changed some policies about rental subsidies. There were less available, so less families were leaving shelter. But there was also an increase in the number of families entering shelter. And so we wanted to gain a better understanding of families' living situations prior to entering shelter. Like the title of this report, why they're entering shelter, what sort of housing they lived in, and what neighborhoods they came from. And we think this is important to think about as you're crafting prevention policies, shelter policies. You want to know what sort of problems families are facing and also where to target those programs. And a little more background on the family shelter system. In New York City, in order to enter family shelter, unlike single adult shelter, you have to apply and be found eligible. The city says that a family must have no other viable housing situation before they allow them into family shelter. This is a bit controversial. Single adults do not have to go through this procedure. They sort of show up, provide some identification, and enter shelter. Families have to provide a lot of background information, where they used to live, and then DHS investigates this to make sure they have nowhere else to go. It provides us, sort of happily, with a lot of data. And so most of the data we used for this project came from looking at the application forms of what's collected when families enter shelter. So we got a database from the Department of Homeless Services that had data on families that entered shelter between fiscal years 2002 to 2012. That's 11 years of data. Variables included a family ID. That's a unique identifier for each family as they enter and exit the system. We had the dates they entered shelter, the dates they exited shelter, the reason why DHS determined they were eligible for shelter. So there's the DHS does this eligibility investigation, and at the end of it, when they decide, okay, this family has no other living situation, they assign a primary reason why. And those examples of those are eviction, domestic violence, overcrowding, aging out of foster care. There's a lot of different reasons. So we had that for each entry into shelter, as well as the address families lived in right before they entered shelter, and some demographic data. So for this study, we defined a new entry into shelter as either the first time a family entered shelter, or if they had been in shelter, left, and came back, as long as there were at least 30 days between that last exit and new entry. We defined that as a new entry into shelter. So our data set had about almost 96,000 of these entries. Of those, there were almost 76,000 families. So what that means is about 20% of the families in our data set entered more than once over this 11-year study period. The majority of those that entered more than once entered twice, like I think it's 75% entered twice, with an average of a little over 2 years between entries. So they'll be counted more than once in our data set. And then we geocoded the prior address field that we got so we could match it with other city building data that we had. For example, buildings, we know we have a data set of buildings that have rent regulated units, which buildings are public housing, and to find more information about the size of the building and the location. We were able to do this for most of the entries, 79%. We were unable to geocode, and you can see the reasons here why, for about 20%. The big reason, 12% had no prior address, and this was mainly in the early part of our study period. So clearly, if there were no prior addresses, we couldn't match it with anything. Okay, this actually doesn't come from our data set that we got from DHS, but I wanted to provide a little context about what was going on during the Bloomberg administration in terms of applications to shelter and families being found eligible. So if you look at this, there's a lot going on here, but if you look at the bar graph first and sort of just ignore the colors, the bars show the number of the average number of applications per month in that fiscal year to enter shelter. So in fiscal year 2002, about almost 1,700 families applied for shelter on average each month. In fiscal year 2012, there's a very big increase, and almost 3,000, 71% more, applied on average for shelter each month. So now we're going to look at the blue. So it's increasing over the study period, but if you look at the blue line, the blue bar, those are the average number of families that were actually found eligible. So in fiscal year 2002, we'll take that as an example, 680 of the nearly 1,700 families were found eligible, about 40%. In fiscal year 2012, about a little over 1,000, or 36% of families were found eligible. So what we see happening is, if you follow this green line on the top, that's the eligibility rate. It drops over the study period. So more people are applying to shelter, a smaller share are getting in. We actually see an increase in absolute terms of the number of families entering shelter, but more families aren't getting in. So it became more difficult to enter shelter during the Bloomberg administration. And this is important to consider as we look at the other findings. And you can see, just if we take a look at the blue bar, this is the families that are actually getting in. The number of families peaks in fiscal year 2010, in the middle of the Great Recession, falls a little bit in 2011 and 12. If you were to continue this on, which we don't in this particular report, but you'll see it going up again, actually. Okay. Question? So now we're going to talk about why families enter shelter. And I'm just going to remind you, this is a reason DHS determines why families are entering shelter. It's a proxy for a homelessness reason that a family would give. It's not exact, but we think it's a fairly good representation because DHS does an investigation into this. So, some of the top reasons families are found eligible for shelter are overcrowding, and that is the lime green bar. Overcrowding means that a family was living in some sort of situation where there potentially weren't enough beds for children of different genders, an addition of a cot, created a fire hazard, and DHS goes out to the family's prior address to investigate these claims. So that's overcrowding. Eviction is the pink sort of salmon-y bar, and domestic violence is blue. Discord, not DV, so some sort of discord in the home that's not the level of DV, that's that sort of brownish orange. And then
Is
some,
that the one, are you going from the top
I'm going
down
from the
or
bottom to
bottom
the
up?
top. So this is overcrowding, the green, and then followed by eviction, domestic violence, discord, not ruled to be domestic violence, unlivable conditions is the purple, and then out of town is an eligibility determination. That's the light blue. It falls off in fiscal year 2006. That's an eligibility determination that the city stopped using, and I think they were more, okay, so a family came from out of town, but why were they coming from out of town? More detail on, you know, whether they evicted, overcrowded, that sort of thing. So if you just look at the shares, you can see that overcrowding was the most common eligibility determination at the beginning of our study period, through just fiscal years 2002 through 2005. That drops off, and we see a real increase in the families found eligible because of eviction and domestic violence. And we're going to talk about each of those in more detail now.
Elizabeth, is this self-reporting by the individual seeking shelter?
No. So what happens is DHS does this investigation, and it's very thorough. I mean, they send people out
They go to every home that
they go to people's homes and knock on the doors and look around, and they call landlords and they ask for eviction documentation of an eviction. They have it's in the report. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they spend a fair amount of money on this eligibility investigation.
Just out of curiosity, does it say how long it takes them to do that investigation? So
Yeah.
how long are these people waiting for?
They have to. I'm not sure how long it takes from beginning to end, but they have 10 days until they make a final determination.
Okay, so it's not 6 months. Or
No, they have to, and they have to provide shelter during this investigation too. So there is an incentive to get it done quickly.
And the procedures and kind of the criteria for classification were substantially the same over time, or?
Yes, I mean, domestic violence we're going to talk about a little bit. That changed somewhat, but if you look at the current sort of instruction manual for this, it looks like it was printed in 1970. So things have remained relatively stable.
And then this does not include the domestic violence shelter system, only the
not.
DHS shelter system.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm gonna
Does
talk
everybody
about
know
a
that
little
there's
bit
two
later,
separate systems?
This is just DHS.
And are these families that entered, that means they were accepted
These
into
are- yes,
shelter?
good question.
It's not necessarily the families that applied for shelter.
Exactly right. We only
Okay.
have data on families that actually got in.
Because it doesn't necessarily mean that fewer families with overcrowding applied.
You're absolutely
It just
right.
means fewer families with overcrowding were accepted.
Yes, and that's why I wanted to show you that first graph at the beginning. In a perfect world, we would have data on ineligibles too, and you could say, okay,
Right.
who was getting sent home?
Do they have that data on ineligibles?
I mean, this data set is used for sort of tracking families, so really they care about the families that are getting in.
They're paying for.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it might not be collected in such a nice way that we could get it, but DHS could have a lot of data that we don't know about. So this sort of speaks to your point.
I just have a very kind of simple question. How does the city establish that somebody is out of town?
Sorry?
It would seem to me that how does the city establish that someone is out of town?
How does the city establish
Oh, they
whether
ask
someone's
for
out of
your most recent address. So I mean, this is self-reported by the family. So they'll ask where they ask actually for the most recent address and then a bunch before that too. It's like the 5 prior most recent
Do
addresses.
they
I
ask for
think.
like verification, like utility bills or something like that, or it's all self-reported?
Well, they call and then they go there. So they'll ask for people's names. They ask for these addresses so they can go to these addresses and investigate whether a family can go back to live there. If it's an eviction, for example, I mean, that might be more difficult if the family isn't living there anymore, but they ask for housing court documents. They'll call the landlord. I mean, a lot of this has to do, I mean, DHS will say too, during the intake procedure, they want to try to stop is there anything they have some anti-eviction legal services. Is there anything they can do to stop the eviction?
And in the out of town, is there a minimum time in the city, even for the right to shelter eligibility, or no?
No. And I think some cities do that, but New York doesn't. Okay, so this is detail on just the families being found eligible for overcrowding. So you see a decrease it was decreasing in terms of shares over our study period because there were some upticks in 2009 to 2010. We do see increases in absolute terms of the number of families entering shelter from overcrowded conditions, but overall, it's going down in terms of shares of families entering shelter. So DHS provides a little more detail on who the family was living with prior to shelter. The pink and the largest part of the bar is if a family was living with their parent, so the primary applicant's parent prior to shelter. The lime green is if they were living with another relative besides the parent, and blue with a non-relative or a friend. If you look at 2002 and 2012, and you compare the pink and the pink, you see that that is where most of the decrease is taking place. Far fewer families are entering shelter, leaving their mother's house, for example, because it's overcrowded. The blue and the green stay relatively stable. That's where we really see the sort of cut. And also, we don't talk about it here, but when you looked at the average age of the head of household, we found that was getting older over our study period.
So this is a reflection of DHS activity at intake, right? Trying
yes.
push people back to
Or have them stand
where they
there.
are.
We don't have that data on ineligibles, but if you think back to that first graph and you see that the biggest decline was in families living with their parents, that's conceivably an easier place to send people back to.
But isn't that also with NYCHA where they stopped really pushing people out with people were doubling up and they got a little more lax in how they were enforcing who lives in the house?
Well, actually, the DHS was trying to send people back, and then NYCHA was saying they're going to make a family's going to violate their lease if you keep sending people back. So they've been trying to do some more interagency coordination on, DHS not sending people back to NYCHA, just because it'll cause other people there to lose their lease, and then you have even more families that are in
Do
need
you
of
have
emergency
that
housing.
breakdown of how many of these come from NYCHA?
Yes, we'll be getting there in a moment. So just one other thing here. We wanted to look at overcrowding in the city overall to provide a little context. Was overcrowding going down, the share of overcrowding housing overall? I mean, probably you all are going to say, no, it wasn't, and it really wasn't. We used the housing vacancy survey to check the share of overcrowded units over our study period, and there was not a significant change at all, especially to this extent.
Elizabeth Dunn has a
Oh,
question.
so is there any kind of explicit or implicit cap on new entrants, or was this kind of behavior to prioritize, or?
Yeah, there's no cap. I mean, the city has to provide shelter if the family needs it. There's some wiggle room on needing it potentially. So, I mean, if you think about it in terms of money, there was a big increase in the number of applications. Emergency shelter is very expensive, so you do want to capture the neediest families in shelter. So, there might be a fiscal incentive to keep those numbers lower.
But there's no physical limitation as to how
No.
many apartments
You would
or
think
places?
there would be,
I mean,
but
yes.
no. So they have the tier 2 shelters, which are the traditional homeless shelters, and there are a limit. But the city's been more and more relying on the use of hotels and scatter site housing. So quite frankly, the Department of Homeless Services has been entering into these emergency contracts as well, where fairly little notification, just because they have to house these families somewhere.
Now, this is a result of lawsuits that the city has settled, saying they would shelter individuals and then families.
It's a legal mandate.
Right, these lawsuits are from the early 80s, actually.
I think it has to do with the law versus housing capacity, right?
Right.
Those are different things.
Have to do it. So here, this is more detail on families entering shelter because of eviction. Again, DHS provides a little bit more detail on who was evicted that the family is entering shelter. So blue in this bar chart signifies families that the applicant, let's say the mother, was evicted. Green is if the family was living with the mother's parent and they were evicted, that forced the family into shelter. Pink and purple are a non-relative or a relative other than the parent. So as you can see, besides the big increase in the number of families entering because of eviction, by and large, most of the families that are entering shelter because of evicted were themselves evicted. They weren't living with someone that was evicted. And again, we looked at citywide rates to see if the number of eviction had increased, and that would explain at least some of this increase. And we found there was an increase in the number of evictions over our study period, about 17%, which is significant, but not near. If you compare 2002 to 2012, this is a 130% increase in the number of families entering shelter because of eviction.
Could I ask, as far
Sure.
as the families entering shelter due to eviction, where was the greatest growth within boroughs?
I'm not, I don't know if growth over time, I can't remember that, but I think the highest share actually came from the Bronx. So if you were to look, and I'll have to look, I can follow up with that. I actually made a map of it and I can send that to you. But I think the Bronx, I think people tend to think that a lot of these evictions take place in Manhattan, but I think a smaller share were in Manhattan than the Bronx and other boroughs. But I can send you, and it actually might be in the paper, specific detail on that.
The size of families, the composition of families, what are we looking at?
Families have gotten a little bit smaller over our study period. So
It's usually a mother. It is typically a single. I mean, it used to be
a
mother and 1 or 2 kids.
Mhm.
Is that-
That's the typical. I mean, I think it's like 80% of families are headed by a woman. That's in the paper too. But by and large, and that is something that has not changed, over our study period. The families got slightly smaller. Like I think it was 3.4 to 3.1 was the average family size. It sort of changed. So a little bit smaller, and as I mentioned before, the head of household got a little bit older. So you have less of these younger women who are living with their parents prior to shelter, and more slightly older women who were a primary tenant somewhere entering shelter over the study period. Okay, now we're going to look at domestic violence. And as was mentioned, there are 2 separate domestic violence shelter systems in the city. The first one, the specialized DV system, is operated by HRA and this is not data on that. The specialized DV shelter system is anonymous. Those shelters aren't published. They have services geared to women who are people who are survivors of domestic violence. But those shelters are also time limited. Families can only stay there up to 180 consecutive days. And that actually was increased recently. It was shorter, about a year ago. So,
and they're always full, and there's not that many of them.
Right, I think it's about 2,000 beds, and
they're always full, and the overflow ends up here.
Overflow ends up here, so that's what we're going to see here.
Time out.
They time out, they do. So this is, if you ignore the colors for a moment, we see again a big increase in the number of families entering shelter because of domestic violence. We looked at the citywide. Is there more domestic violence in the city? Why is there such a big increase? And there was an increase in the reported incidence of domestic violence. We looked at police data for that. But I think, in talking with people who work in homeless services, I think a lot of this increase also has more to do with DHS and the city getting better at screening for domestic violence. During the intake process over our study period, additional opportunities to identify as a survivor of domestic violence were added. More opportunities to speak with HRA staff from the NOVA unit, No Violence Again. So more safeguards were added during our study period, and I think that has something to do with the increase. I think DHS got better at classifying families as survivors of domestic violence. There is an increase. I think the increase in reported incidents citywide also has to do with the administration sort of pushing for more awareness about the issue.
Is there any explanation for the slight drop in 2011 and 12?
That just has more to do with the fact that the number of families entering shelter in those years fell slightly, so the shares remained relatively similar over time, around 30% over probably from 2009 through the end of the study period.
So you're saying that despite that there is some degree of cyclicality, that once the recession, numbers were going up during the recession have come down a bit, but there's this longer term trend where it's all going up.
Yes, yeah, it's going up again. So now I just want to bring your attention to the colors on the bar charts. In the middle of our study period, in the middle of fiscal year 2009, DHS added another classification for these DV families, and this is sort of less interesting to me, but green signifies the family was offered shelter in the specialized system and said, no, I'd rather stay in the DHS sort of general population shelter system. I don't know exactly why you would do that, except for the fact maybe you know that the other shelter system is time limited and you'll have to move out fast.
Move out again.
Of course. The pink is more interesting to me, and they added this classification in the middle of fiscal year 2011. But let's look at fiscal year 2012 because that's the only year we have a full year of data. And so pink means the family had been in the specialized DV system, timed out, and entered DHS. And that's about 30% of the entries in fiscal year 2012. That's a significant, that families are sort of just cycling through.
In other words, we're not finding permanent homes.
They're not finding permanent housing and then entering this shelter system.
Yeah, and I had heard that from some of our agencies that run both, that there's this cycling in,
They are proposed or passed a local law that would make it easier for families, because during our study period, a family would be in the DV shelter system, the specialized, and then they'd have to go through the whole application procedure again. So they're trying to change it now, or may have actually changed it, that a family can just move over into the DHS shelter system.
Is there did you count as part of the study domestic violence set-aside units?
No, I mean in DHS there aren't any.
Not necessarily DHS, but there's set-aside domestic violence units amongst what would be Neighborhood Preservation Corporation developers.
We didn't look at housing after shelter, but that's a good point. And actually, I think it's a new priority with NYCHA. The DV priority has been raised with NYCHA. So if you're DV and in DHS, you have a much likely. Well, let's not say that much higher, but you're higher on the list than you would be to get into public housing. Yeah.
But in addition to public housing, there would be through HPD, what would be housing developments, and they're not across the board. They're very. It's because the local organization has identified that as a need within the local neighborhood, but that can be perhaps a highlight that we should be monitoring to be able to understand, well, if families are cycling like this, they've mastered what would be staying in housing through the DHS system.
And if you get them into that specialized housing, you wouldn't see that pink line. Yeah.
That's the 30% that we should be targeting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Spending a significant time in shelter. Now we're going to move away from eligibility reasons, well, sort of, for a moment. This has a lot of numbers, so we're going to look at the type of housing families lived in before they entered shelter. So ignore the numbers for a second, and you can look at the top columns where it says prior housing type. So we have rent-regulated housing. And look down at the yellow number, 32,166 families came from rent-regulated housing over our study period. And this was the most common type of housing families lived in prior to shelter. 43% of the entries that we were able to match lived in rent-regulated housing prior to shelter. The non-regulated private housing, that's the next category, 39% or 29,610 families came from non-regulated private housing. The majority of the families that entered from this type of housing lived in smaller buildings. Rent regulation only applies to buildings that have 6 or more units. About, I think it's, 84% of the families that came from the non-regulated private housing lived in buildings smaller than 6 units, so rent regulation would never have applied to them. We found a very significant portion of those, nearly 50%, lived in very small buildings, 1 to 2 to 3 family homes. So that seems to be a very significant source of families entering shelter as well.
In neighborhoods. In certain neighborhoods.
In certain neighborhoods, yeah.
Right?
We'll get to that too. And then lastly, we had the families coming from NYCHA for public housing. And so 12,261, or 16% of the entries over our study period came from public housing. And I would say that the distribution from families coming from rent-regulated, non-regulated, public housing didn't change dramatically over our study period. There was a slight increase in the number of families coming from the non-regulated housing towards the end of our study period. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, we were missing prior address data more often early in the study period, so that might just have to do with data that we didn't have. And so we also looked at, now we're going to look at these pink numbers I've highlighted, if there was a difference in why families were entering shelter depending on the housing type they lived in. So if you look at rent-regulated housing and non-regulated housing, the most common reason families entered shelter from those types of housing was because of eviction, a little over 30% for each. Public housing, however, had a different sort of distribution. Overcrowding was the most common reason families entered shelter because of NYCHA, and it might speak to what we were talking about. NYCHA asked DHS to not send families back in the same way that they had been doing. So we might see that borne out in the data there.
So that means they weren't thrown out of NYCHA for being doubled up, but they voluntarily left?
Well, there could have been pressure placed on the tenant. You never know. We don't know. We just know that they were living in NYCHA. People at NYCHA could have been putting pressure on the tenant. You have too many people here. You're going to get in trouble. You know, we don't know that. We don't know that. But I mean, we also, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know how many of these families were actually tenants of NYCHA and how many were just there. And domestic violence, though, was also a more significant reason why families left NYCHA housing than the other two types of housing. So maybe some money going to DV and NYCHA would be a good idea. So we're going to finish up looking at the locations where families came from. This is a map by neighborhood. I don't think it would really surprise anybody here, the distribution. The darkest color is where the more families came from. The highest share of families came from the Bronx, 39%. And then you can see central Brooklyn, the second highest share came from Brooklyn. Upper Manhattan contributed a fair amount compared to the rest of the city. And these are the top neighborhoods. So this is over our entire study period, the top neighborhoods where families came from prior to shelter. And despite the fact that the Bronx had the most families entering shelter, the top 3 neighborhoods are actually in Brooklyn: Crown Heights North, East New York, Stuyvesant Heights. And if we continue this list longer, you could see more of the Bronx coming up.
What is Stuyvesant Heights?
That's south from the land.
These are Department of City Planning names of neighborhoods.
Crown Heights North takes in Atlantic Avenue down to Eastern Parkway and Prospect Weapons. A lot of gentrification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll just sort of end with a little sum up of our conclusions. We saw the number of families entering the shelter system grew over our study period, and this is despite the fact that a smaller share of the overall number of applicants were found eligible for shelter during the time period. The top reasons for shelter eligibility have shifted over our study period, from overcrowding to eviction and domestic violence. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we think it's important to consider these pre-shelter experiences when the city is crafting shelter prevention policies and also targeting them.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
I assume that you've shared these findings with the deputy mayor and with the relevant agencies?
We've oversees it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's...
the Department of Homeless Services obviously knew what we were doing, and they are well aware of this, but...
Do they disagree?
No, they don't disagree.
Would it be worth looking at length of stay by the categories you have?
Absolutely. We have a
See
lot
whether
more we would
domestic
like to do with
violence,
this data.
people stay
Yeah,
longer.
length of stay is a good one,
Yeah.
especially because the city only really put out an average length of stay, and so it'd be great to get more of a distribution.
Do you have in here, I didn't look at the whole thing, some demographic information? Do you
Mhm.
have age and race and things like this?
Yeah, there's just a section on that in there.
Do you think a decline in eligibility rate is any form of kind of informal rationing or any way of assessing that?
I will say it's very expensive. It's expensive to shelter a family, so you want to. It's expensive to shelter a family, and if you want to keep costs down, you let less in, especially when you see such an increase in applications.
I hope that you're able to link this report with the work that you're doing in students in temporary housing, so we can see what tends to happen with that. Because we found in education that many of the students leave because of eviction or domestic violence, that they're moving from school to school, and that's why we get these students. So I know you're doing an extensive report on students in temporary housing. It would be interesting to see what the correlations are.
We will try.
And I wanted to just ask, as far as the last decade of production of affordable housing, what is the relationship between families entering that are the ones that are cycling through all the time from the same neighborhoods in relationship to the production and matching those families to those units?
We actually found in the beginning, we actually found that there was, and this might have to do with the time period we're looking at, there was actually less. I was surprised by the number, and also this has to do with the way DHS may or may not assign a family ID, but there was actually a little bit less cycling than I initially anticipated. We found out of our almost 76,000 families, only 20% entered more than once. Families are staying a long time, so that's maybe why you see a smaller percent, but I thought it would be higher. And it might be that if we had a little cap, if you were out of shelter for less than 30 days, we didn't count it as a new entry, so it might be that families are leaving for a very short amount of time and then coming back.
Yeah.
But the cycling actually seemed to be less of an issue, at least during this study period.
And so I take out
anticipated.
the word cycling, right? Because what I notice in Brooklyn, it's the same neighborhoods over and over again, and the same band,
And it
right?
has been for years.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct.
That's why
Nothing's changed. And so what I'd like to understand is, in the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning, we had what would be the anticipation of displaced families to be recognized in the application process of production units. Whether or not HPD has followed that, right, by placing what would be the simple checkbox, were you displaced? Did you live here as of this date? And in this new administration, to making sure that if that is a policy that works, that we're able to take what is the next decade of production of units to be able to match up to these families that are being displaced as part of a policy that has to be enforced, monitored, and encouraged. Because the production units are not necessarily being monitored to service the DHS families.
And also, this needs you need a really high subsidy for these families. Homeless set-asides are very expensive.
Right.
And I think the de Blasio administration is looking into reaching the lowest income. I mean, a lot of the housing that's produced, for example, in the former mayor's plan, was for families. These families would never be.
That's
able
right.
to
There's
afford
affordable,
them.
and then there's
Yes.
affordable
There's
to
a-
these
to
families.
This is very low income.
That's right. So a lot of the so-called affordable housing is never going to be affordable for these
For this
families.
one.
Without some sort of rental subsidy. And they really need a rental subsidy.
Right, and that's where the Section 8 eviction, Section 8 subsidies, emergency vouchers kick in, right? But it's a matter of
So
coordination.
They
and
used to kick in.
And so I just find that there isn't enough correlation between what is a certain percentage of these families that are. I know of a family that, the mom was a home attendant. She had the income, was in a family shelter, and
couldn't get the housing.
right.
Anyone?
Thank you. Because you are pointing out to two major drivers, domestic violence and eviction. There are others, of course, but I would, and considering your third point, I would be very interested in understanding what's happening before eviction. To what extent historically had to do with when the rental subsidies were abolished, how much eviction was driven that way,
Right.
To what extent there are working adults in the one or two in the families, but affordability, I'm talking about for working families. My understanding is that currently a significant portion of families in shelter, the shelter system, are working families. And so I think it's important to understand how we find ourselves there, because so I would be very interested in more of the pre-eviction information, household income or working adults or not, or so that for the current reality that we're in, what would be the appropriate type of policy on rental assistance that would be worthwhile for the city to do?
DHS collects that data. I mean, we asked for it, we didn't get it, but data on income and whether a family was working. And this is, I think I mentioned this before I started, but that's part of the application for shelter. We wanted to know, did a family have a rental subsidy before they entered shelter? They did say they didn't have it in the right form, collected
Easily to
yeah,
do
I think they have it in an application, but don't maybe database it the way they do these other variables. But I think that's very important.
You know, I think, Anna, they're taking a step towards prioritizing families where there's a working head of household, a working adult. When there's the de Blasio administration has extracted a set aside from NYCHA for families from the shelter system. Some could say it's too little, some could say it's too much, but I think it's 750 units this year. And those who will get priority for those units are those with a working head of household, which I've heard the figure somewhere between 25 and 30%.
That's what I heard as
like
well.
28% of the
Yes.
families
Yes.
in the shelter system have a
Yes.
working head of household,
Yes.
which of course
Yes.
gets to the the wage issue and many other things. But so I think there's a recognition, at least with this first step, of saying, okay, let's try to move those folks out. They have the income that can sustain housing, and give them priority for the NYCHA units. But I don't know how it's working, whether it's
They
started.
also have one of the new LINK. They have these 5 new called LINK programs. They're new rental subsidy programs.
Yes.
One of them is aimed at working families.
But I feel like that's the low-hanging fruit. If you can move 25%,
Absolutely.
if you can move 25% out, you open up a
Absolutely.
lot of space.
And it's not just for NYCHA, it's for the affordable
Right.
housing production
Yeah, and
outside of
And
NYCHA.
presumably, if they're working, they have a way to sustain the housing.
financial gap.
Yeah.
Last question from
Do we know if NYCHA uses, if DHS uses recidivism rates as a part of its performance metrics for the shelter providers, so that they're just not, because part of the problem is if they're just going back into shelter, the shelter providers might not be responsible, but if you send them into NYCHA in an overcrowding situation, the shelter provider can still say, well, we got them into permanent housing, so it's not our fault.
I don't think they do. I can't say for sure, but for a while, after when they ended the Advantage program, there's something called a PIP. So it affected your funding if you were moving people out of shelter. They put that on a hiatus with the Advantage program. I'm actually not sure if they've reinstated it yet since there's new rental subsidy programs. So yeah, you would get more money if you place people in shelter, so there would be an incentive.
Right.
I mean, as it should be, as a mission-driven organization, to place people in housing. I don't know that if they then followed up to see did the people come back. I'm not sure.
I
It's a
think
good
they
question.
may have that measure.
Okay, they might.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for a provocative report. If anybody has any more questions of Elizabeth, let's carry on with that after the meeting. We have another presentation coming up, and we need to get through that. And that would be Ronnie and George.
Okay, I'm just looking at the economic outlook so that George can talk about the fiscal outlook. Just quickly looking at the U.S. economic outlook, 2014 was a really big year because it was the year that the U.S. economy finally gained momentum. The recovery became self-sustaining. Business investment and hiring picked up. Employment rose rapidly, actually at a rate that we hadn't seen since the late 90s. And that growing employment pushed down the unemployment rate. Not only did the regular unemployment rate go down, but we also saw declines in long-term unemployment, which were most welcome. And a combination of the rising employment and incomes, reduced debt levels, happily low gas prices really have combined to boost consumer and business confidence. And all of that has been good. Another big plus over the last year is that finally monetary and fiscal policy are actually pulling in the same direction. Interest rates have remained low. We finally got through the period of contractionary fiscal policy, so the federal budget actions are not acting as a drag to growth. And we actually have an adopted budget for the current federal fiscal year, which eliminated at least some of the uncertainty that we've been having over the budget showdowns, and perhaps even the possibility of shutdowns. All of that has abated, and all of that is good news. Our forecast for this year and next in terms of real growth in gross domestic product is bullish, although the consensus forecast is gradually closing in on where we were last month. We're expecting growth of 3.5%, again inflation adjusted this year, and just under that next year. That's up a lot from last year, but most of last year was actually quite good. It was just the first quarter that was dismal, and much of that was actually weather-related. Our forecast, as usual, is more optimistic than OMB's, but not that much more optimistic. OMB is forecasting 2.9% growth for this. These are calendar years. I should have said that at the top. For the current calendar year, compared to our 3.5%, not that much of a difference, and even less of a difference the next year. After that, the situation reverses, and we're a little less optimistic than OMB. But all in all, it's an optimistic forecast, and we're very much at this point in the mainstream. It's probably bad news that everybody is now agreeing. City situation is pretty much the opposite. I mean, at the national level, the recovery really didn't take hold until the last year. In contrast, the city of New York has been growing robustly for 4 years now. We added, based upon data that was released yesterday, we added 86,000 jobs in 2014. That's the 4th straight year of gains of 80 plus. Moreover, this data is based upon a survey. The survey gets revised every spring based upon actual data from the unemployment system for people who have to file and companies that have to file the information with the government. So there's an actual enumeration of people working and not working. And that data was released in the spring, and we anticipate, based upon the partial data that's already out there, that that number for job growth in 2014 could actually top 100,000. And if it does, it would actually be the strongest job year on record for the city. So jobs have been growing robustly for 4 years now. The same isn't true for wages after you adjust for inflation. And in fact, they've been drifting down. But after 2 years of absolute declines, again in real terms, there was an average increase of 5.6% in wages, in real wages for 2014. So we finally got some good wage growth. A lot of it was admittedly securities, which had a terrific bonus season last year. But still, if you exclude securities, the increase averaged 3.7%. And if you look not at the rates of increase, but just at the levels and adjust for inflation, average wages remain just slightly short of what the peak was overall. But if you exclude securities, the average wage level in 2014 finally surpassed the peak in 2007. So we had a lot of employment growth over 4 years, not a whole lot of wage growth. We're now starting to get some of the wage growth, and it's not just securities.
Can I just ask for you said 2 years of decline. Were there actual declines in the securities industry, or was it really?
Securities industry had been declining sharply. Last year, there was a lot more growth, in part because they changed the bonus compensation, the bonus system. There was a lot more deferred compensation. There were a lot more of these people who were able to cash out those stock options. So they had a really good year last year, and there seems to be some of that going on this year as well. So yeah, securities took a beating, but they were coming off of a very much higher wage base. Of greater concern in many ways were the people, everybody else, whose wages were also, after adjusting for inflation, drifting down. Our forecast, we're expecting another 80,000 jobs this year and 75,000 in 2016, with smaller increases the following 2 years of the forecast period. This is a big difference between our forecast and OMB's, because OMB is projecting considerably less job growth. It's like a third less job growth in the next couple of years. And we're expecting real wages to rise, and rise considerably faster than they did during the early part of the city's recovery.
Can you break out where you think those jobs are going to come from?
Yes, I do, and we'll have some of that on the next slide. Okay, taking a closer look at where the jobs are going to come from.
All right.
Right. The first two columns here are shares of employment growth. It's not all sectors. I just highlighted a few I wanted to talk about. And this column looks at the early stages of the recovery, roughly 2009 through 14, and then 2014 through 18, which is our forecast period. And then the last column shows average wages. And these first four categories are education and healthcare, professional and business services, retail, trade, and leisure and hospitality. These are the four sectors that have provided the lion's share of job growth during the recovery, before the recovery, for years now. This has been where the job growth has come from. If this number looks extraordinarily high, if you add these four numbers together, that's because these are the shares of the increase. There are some sectors that were losing jobs, and so if, this sums to 96%. And it doesn't mean that there weren't other sectors that were gaining jobs, it just means that there were other sectors losing. We're anticipating that there's going to be a shift in this. Yes, education, healthcare, and professional and business services are still going to be over half of the new jobs we expect to create. But we're expecting that fewer of the new jobs are going to be coming from retail trade and fewer from leisure and hospitality, restaurants, hotels.
Is that because we already have so many?
Part of it is because, given what's going on in the world, we're anticipating that we're not going to see the same degree of growth in the tourism industry that we've had in the past. At least that's our current forecast. And what that means is that fewer of the jobs are going to be coming from two sectors where average wages are extraordinarily low. And if that's the case, that's not bad news. I want to say something, just highlight the information sector. There are sufficient jobs in information now that it's really starting to show up as a major contributor of jobs. It's growing fast, wages are good, although again, there's a lot of different kinds of information jobs, and there's a difference between the technology-oriented information jobs and employment in magazines and newspapers, which of course has been declining. And the other sector I wanted to highlight was securities. It is a huge component and a major driver, still the biggest driver of the city's economy. During the 2009 to 2014 period, securities actually continued to lose employment. There was some up and some down, but overall it went down, as did average wages within securities. But even though they were declining as a share, they still accounted for 3% of employment growth. I'm sorry. They were declining as a share here, but going forward, we're expecting that to change. And as a matter of fact, with the revised numbers, we're expecting the revised numbers to show that securities is finally coming back up.
The size of that average wage.
Yeah.
Securities is the entire financial sector, or just a subset?
No, just the securities component of this.
Component.
Yeah, it's not
In
financial.
terms of employment, that's a big part of the entire financial sector?
It's about half.
It is that
About
much?
half.
Okay.
It's also the one that's just the way the reporting categories are set up, it's the one you can really easily grab.
So the prediction of increase in jobs that is different from is happening in which sectors in your prediction? I'm relating to the prior.
Where the jobs are growing?
Yeah, where do you see them growing? I'm trying to look there and see.
I think within the report we've got a detailed chart, a detailed table on where we expect the jobs to be.
Okay.
There's 6 pie charts.
Yes.
That should help, and some other numbers that you can tie back to.
Thank
And if you
you.
have questions, let us know.
Thank
Okay?
Could you pass one of these?
Let me take one more moment with the securities industry. These two charts look at revenues, expenses, and profits for New York Stock Exchange member firms. This is not the whole of the securities industry, but it serves as a good bellwether for the rest of the industry, and these figures are readily available. The dark bar is revenues, the red bar is expenses. If you look at revenues, you can see how they ran up during the boom and then collapsed. Revenues remain roughly half of what they were during the boom, at the height of the boom. The biggest difference between there and now is firms trading on their own account, which has been constrained with new financial regulations, although there's a question about how well those regulations are holding and whether they're changing. Expenses ran up and then came down. The difference between revenues and expenses is profits, and profits are charted separately on the lower line. So you can see where profits collapsed, zoomed up again, and have settled into something along the $15 billion range each year, which is what our forecast is. These are reasonable profits. They're not great, they're not terrible, but in historical levels, they're not bad. And the question is how the industry is continuing to earn a reasonable level of profits, given that revenues are so much lower than they were. And the answer to that is because expenses are so much lower, and particularly interest expenses are so much lower. Right? And the reason interest expenses, part of the reason that interest expenses are so much lower is because interest rates are very, very low. So the question becomes, can the securities industry continue to maintain profits at this level or grow profits when interest rates begin to rise? And I think in terms of major questions for the local economy, that's right up there. The other big questions that we see in terms of risks to the forecast and risks to local economic growth is just what's happening elsewhere in the world. I mean, we really do rely a lot on what's happening elsewhere in the world. And also whether the Fed will succeed in pulling off a transition to a more conventional monetary policy. So will long-term interest rates spike when they start to raise the short end? And all of those are open questions, and they're all risks, and we've left George with 10 minutes to do everything else.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly summarize the results from our fiscal outlook report that we published in December, which already to me seems like a long time ago because we're getting ready for the next budget update in February. When we do our fiscal outlook report, we're trying to look ahead and set the table for people who are going to be making budget policy for the coming year. So we take current policy, in this case it's what was in the mayor's financial plan in November when they released the budget modification. And then we do our own re-estimate of expenses and revenues, assuming what the mayor has left in place in November. And so all of this will change when the preliminary budget comes out and we get a set of actual. Usually in November there aren't significant budget policy proposals from the mayor, but in January or February there will be when the mayor releases his preliminary budget. One other housekeeping thing, Ronnie's been talking calendar years. Everything I'm going to do going forward is back to fiscal years. So. There we go. Okay, so since I probably won't get through all of this, here are the major findings. So far, the administration has not really made significant spending initiatives that show up in the budget. Again, and this is on the expense side of the budget. The capital side, the housing program is beginning to fill in. One of the mayor's other signature initiatives, the Vision Zero and transportation, again, is largely about capital. And so we don't see too much in the expense budget so far.
George, is that because things like the UPK and after-school expansions are largely state funded?
Yes, yeah. They're state funded, and they're not. They're 300 million. It's not.
But that's what we say. We say it's not enough. I mean,
we're talking about a $75 billion budget. Yeah. So. Our revenue outlook is for what I would characterize as moderate tax revenue growth, and unlike in some prior years, at this point, looking out 4 years, we see the tax revenue growth exceeding projected revenue growth by a pretty substantial margin.
Um,
When you say moderate, George, what do you mean by moderate?
Well, I'll get to that in a minute. So IBO's outlook, expenses and revenues together, is more optimistic than the mayor's. We see a larger surplus this year, about $744 million. We assume you take that and you roll it forward into 2016. And if you do that, and then also take into account our higher revenue estimates, we actually see what are essentially balanced budgets in 2016 through 2018. They're rounding differences, really. They're essentially in balance. There are some concerns about, some risk to this budget, largely around HHC and NYCHA, which are entities that are related to the city, but they're not directly in the city budget. And then, of course, we have some of the economic concerns that Ronnie has touched on. Tax revenue outlook. We're forecasting for this year that tax revenues will grow 3.4%. That's actually lower than it was in 2014, the prior year, when it was 5.9%. Some taxes are stronger, particularly the business income taxes, and particularly there it's the general corporation tax and the unincorporated business tax. The bank tax is actually lagging, it's declining this year. But as a group, those taxes are growing, and then the property tax is growing very strongly. It's growing at about 5.4% this year, driven largely by very strong assessments, which reflects the market values in the city. Some of our taxes are a bit weaker. The personal income tax is essentially flat this year. That's largely an artifact of changes in taxpayer behavior that were induced by federal tax policy. People sped up their capital gains realizations a couple of years ago to take advantage of lower rates, and we're now seeing sort of the rebound effect of that, and that's why the income taxes are flat. Transfer taxes, that's on the sale of property, are down a bit this year, at least in our forecast, although I'm having second thoughts about that, and I think when we redo our forecast in February, we'll probably pull those numbers up a bit, because the market has been stronger than we anticipated there. The fact that our 2015 forecast, we're now $1.2 billion over the mayor's budget on tax revenues. It's not too surprising. We were way above the mayor last spring. But even then, we underestimated how strong revenues have been in this year, and when we did our forecast for this report, we had to bring our numbers up too. For 2016, we're expecting revenue growth of about 4.9%, and then in the last couple of years, it's 4.5%. Which one is it?
There's one on the right.
How much of the 2015 difference versus the adopted budget is kind of due to highly uncertain events yet to happen, and how much is kind of in the bank, if you will?
I'd say a fair amount of it is in the bank. I mean, we've got PIT collections, are pretty current. We had a good bonus season that helped with the holding there. Property taxes, that we've got 2 payments in now, and those are the delinquency rates are quite low, so I think a lot of it is done. I said moderate growth, and I think I won't go through all the details on this, but if you focus out here, these 3 years, which are the growth, this is growth in tax revenue from one year to the next. So in 2016, this is 4.9% growth over what revenues were or anticipated for 2015. So if you look out here, the average for these 3 years is about 4.7%. And that's nothing like the double-digit growth that we saw back here. Now, this, of course, was an expansion period, but each year here, you're over 10% in terms of revenue growth. I think a little more striking is if you compare the growth back here, the prior 3-year period, There again, it averaged 6.2% annually over those 3 years. So the fact that we're forecasting 4.7% is, in other words, we're not calling for extraordinary revenue growth to achieve these balanced budgets that we're talking about. I think I'll quickly. I'm happy to talk about some details on things the mayor has added to his budget already. The key thing is these budget projections have their estimate of the cost of the labor contracts including the contracts that haven't been settled. They've put that money is segregated in a labor reserve and not distributed to the agencies, but it's in the overall budget. And there are certainly disputes about exactly how much, how accurate their estimate is of the cost of that, and we're doing some work on that. But they've built in their estimate of the cost, and of course it's pretty substantial. But even with these costs in the 4-year period, we're showing essentially balanced budgets. They didn't add, once they got through the pre-K program, they didn't add much for new needs. One of the other things that's driving up the city budget this year is a lot of federal money for Sandy recovery. And the other thing they did is they've actually put $750 million into their general reserve for each year of the financial plan. So that money is in there. They also added money back into the retiree trust fund.
George, is that different than the Bloomberg administration in terms of contributions to the reserve?
The general reserve, they're carrying a much higher general reserve than the previous administration had done, and substantially above where it's required to be under the regulations. We then add our own revenue expense adjustments. I'll skip over the details on these. I'll note that we did, although the mayor had added money on shelter costs, reflecting some of the information Beth was talking about, we think that they still didn't add enough, and so we've adjusted those numbers up. Major debt service adjustments in this budget. Mostly, these are all about producing savings. The mayor had recognized some of them. We've actually increased the assumed savings on some of the debt service items. This is looking at for spending in the last the coming 4 years. The main point really is that the spending growth that's in the budget is not primarily in agencies. These 3 groups over here, this is health and social services, uniform services, this is education, and these are all other agencies. They're actually going down in terms of spending change over 3 years. Education is going up $2.5 billion at an annual growth rate of 3.7%, but most of that is actually not going into general education classrooms. It goes into charter schools, pre-K special ed, and private contract special ed programs. The parts of the budget that are really the areas that are driving the growth are in fringe benefits, which is health insurance costs, and debt service. Even with the substantial savings they were able to make in the debt service budget, it's still expected to grow $2.5 billion or 6.5% annually. Put all this together, and you've got expenditures expected to grow by about $6.6 billion over this period. That's 2.8% annual growth. And recall that revenues are expected to grow at 4.7%. So this gives you your balanced budget numbers. I won't go through all of this, but here are our surplus or gap projections. We're balanced in 2015. We've got a very, very small deficit of 184 million in 2016, essentially zero. And again, very small surpluses, but functionally we're in balance for those 2 years. And again, expenditures are expected to grow 2.8% with revenues growing 4.7%. So it's a pretty strong picture for the city. And then because we're IBO, we're always worried about risks. HHC and NYCHA the city has a lot of exposure there. The city's done something to help them, but they may, it's quite likely they're going to be called upon to make some significant additional expenditures there. And then we've got some of the issues that Ronnie raised in terms of the economy. So.
A growing economy is a beautiful thing. Thank you, George. We've got 7 minutes, and I'd like to go into executive session so that we can speak about replacement members for our advisory board.